Some stories claw their way into our lives, whether we believe in them or not. They don't ask for permission. They don't wait until we're ready. They linger in the shadows of memory, waiting for the right moment to remind us that safety is just an illusion. Tonight, you'll hear accounts from ordinary people who swore what they witnessed was true. Encounters with the unexplainable. Moments when reality itself fractured. Incidents so disturbing they refuse to fade. But here's the truth. Once you hear them, you carry them. A part of each story stays with you, creeping into the quiet moments when you're alone. When you think you're safe. When the silence feels heavier than it should. That's when the fear becomes real. Because fear is never just a story. Welcome to Farcical Fears. If you crave the kind of horror that feels too close to home, if you want to hear true incidents that people wish they could forget, then you're in the right place. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to Farcical Fears and turn on notifications, because some stories only whisper once, and you don't want to miss the next time the darkness speaks. Now, let's begin with the first incident. Let's move to our first story. I never thought I'd be the type of person to talk about things like this. I'm not superstitious. I never believed in ghosts, or demons, or any of those late-night radio show stories that people swear happened to them. I always thought those people just wanted attention, or they let their imagination take over in the dark. But the truth is, some nights don't end when you turn off the lights. Some nights never leave you, and they follow you forever. That's what happened to me. It started simply enough. I live alone in a small 2-bedroom house in the suburbs. Not the type of neighborhood you'd expect anything unusual from. Lawns are trimmed, neighbors smile when you wave, and the loudest thing you hear most nights is a dog barking down the block. It's the kind of place people move to when they want peace and quiet. I moved there for the same reason. After a bad breakup and a draining job, I wanted quiet. For months, I had it, until the tapping began. The first night, I woke up at exactly 3:11 a.m. I remember the clock clearly, because I squinted at it in confusion. The tapping was light, rhythmic, almost polite. Tap, tap, tap. It came from my bedroom window, the one that faces the street. At first, I thought maybe it was a branch swaying against the glass. But there are no trees in front of my house. My heart picked up. I told myself it was probably a bug, maybe a moth, or just the house settling. I didn't even get up to check. I pulled the blanket over my head, waited, and after a few minutes it stopped. The second night, it happened again. Same time, 3:11 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I sat up in bed, staring at the curtains. I wanted so badly to believe it was just a prank, maybe kids messing around. But my neighborhood didn't really have kids roaming at that hour. I forced myself to get out of bed and walk to the window. I didn't open, it just pulled the curtain aside an inch and peeked out. Nothing, empty street. Silent, the tapping had stopped. I went back to bed, but I barely slept. The sound lingered in my ears, even though it wasn't happening anymore. And something about the silence outside felt wrong. Like it was too complete. The third night, when I heard it again, I froze. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. Tap, tap, tap. I counted the beats between each sound. They were evenly spaced, like someone was patiently trying to get my attention. I whispered to myself, "Don't look, don't look, don't look." My whole body was shaking, but I couldn't stay in bed. Something in me needed proof, needed to see. I grabbed my phone and, instead of going straight to the window, I opened the camera. I set it to video, and slowly, with trembling hands, pushed the phone through the curtain gap so the lens was pointed toward the glass. I didn't look out myself, I just recorded. The tapping continued for almost a minute before it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. When silence finally fell, I yanked the phone back, shut the curtains, and sat frozen in bed. I didn't watch the video until morning. The sunlight made me feel braver, safer. I told myself it would just show an empty street, maybe a moth hitting the glass. But when I pressed play, my blood ran cold. The video was dark, grainy, but you could clearly see my window. For the first 30 seconds, nothing unusual, just faint reflections. Then the tapping began. On the video, I could see it my own reflection in the glass, faint in the darkness of my room. But behind me, something else moved. A second reflection. Taller, leaner. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was studying me from inches away. It wasn't outside. It wasn't in the street. It was inside the room with me. I dropped the phone. My entire body felt numb, like ice water rushing through my veins. I replayed it again and again, hoping it was a trick of the light, some glitch in the camera. But every time, the shape was there standing right behind me, watching. That day, I didn't go to work. I couldn't. I walked through every inch of my house, opening closets, checking under the bed, pulling open cupboards, even crawling into the attic. Nothing, no sign anyone had been inside. And yet, the reflection was there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, my phone clutched in my hand. The digital clock on the wall ticked closer to 3, and I found myself staring at it, begging time to move slower. When 3:11 came, I held my breath. Silence. No tapping. I almost cried with relief, until I remembered the reflection. I grabbed my phone, turned the camera on myself, and pointed it at the living room window. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. The glass reflected me sitting there, pale, terrified. For a moment, there was nothing else. Then, slowly, a tall figure began to fade into view behind me in the reflection. Not moving, just there. I spun around. Nothing, empty room. I looked back at the phone still there. A distorted, elongated shape, its head tilted, as if mocking me. I can't explain what happened after that. The days blurred. I stopped sleeping. I covered all the mirrors in the house with sheets, taped cardboard over the windows. But reflections don't need glass. I began seeing it in puddles, in the black screen of my TV when it was off, even in my own eyes in photographs. Always behind me, always tilting its head, always waiting. The strangest part, it never hurt me. It never spoke. It just watched patiently, like it knew something I didn't. Like it was waiting for me to break, and maybe I did. Because I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I'm telling you this as a warning, or as a confession. All I know is that when the tapping starts again tonight, at 3:11, I won't look away. This time, I think it wants me to see it clearly, and maybe this time, I will. I told myself I wouldn't look away. I told myself I'd finally face it. But when the night came, and the clock struck 3:11, I realized how unprepared I really was. The sound started again, the same as before, soft, deliberate, patient, tap, tap, tap. I lay in bed, every muscle stiff, my throat dry like I'd swallowed sand. My phone was on the nightstand, camera app already open. My hand trembled as I reached for it. The tapping grew louder, closer, as though the glass was the only barrier between us. I lifted the phone, pressed record, and pointed it toward the window. I couldn't bring myself to peel back the curtain this time. The seconds dragged. Then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. My own heartbeat filled my ears, ragged and too loud. And then, the faintest whisper. Not outside, not on the glass. Behind me, I whipped around, nearly dropping the phone. Nothing, just the shadowed outline of my dresser, the silent doorway leading into the hall. But when I turned the camera back toward the window, my blood froze. The reflection was there again, taller than me, impossibly thin. Its head bent, as if listening to my thoughts. This time, though, it wasn't still. It moved. It raised one hand, long and skeletal, and pressed it against the glass in the reflection. I felt my chest tighten as I realized my window made no sound. No hand was touching it. But on the screen, the thing's palm pressed closer. Fingers splayed unnaturally wide, until the glass seemed to ripple under its weight. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even scream. My instincts screamed at me to run, to leave. But some darker part of me wanted to see what it would do. The screen glitched for a split-second static, a smear of distortion, and then the reflection was gone. The window showed only me, pale and trembling. Relief crashed over me like a wave. But before I could even take a breath, I felt it. Cold air brushed against the back of my neck. I spun so fast I nearly toppled. Out of bed, the room was empty. But I knew it was close. Not behind the glass. Not in the reflection. In the room. With me I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, light on, phone clutched like a weapon I knew was useless. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to lean closer. I must have passed out from exhaustion, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was spilling across the floor. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe it had been a nightmare. But when I grabbed my phone to check the video, my stomach lurched. The recording was still running. Over 4 hours of footage, I skimmed through it, fast-forwarding until my own sleeping body appeared on screen. I watched, transfixed, as the reflection in the window slowly reappeared behind me. Not standing, not tilting its head. This time it crouched, level with my bed, inches from my sleeping face. And then, it smiled. Let's move to our second story. I was 17 when it happened. Old enough to think I understood the world. But young enough to still believe camping in the woods with my friends was just harmless fun. There were 4 of us: me, Jason, my best friend Tyler, and my cousin Hannah. We didn't have money for a big trip or anything extravagant, so when summer came, we decided on a cheap adventure. One weekend in the state forest, just outside town, a couple of tents, some food, and a cooler of sodas. That was all we needed. The first night was fine. We pitched our tents near a clearing, roasted hot dogs over the fire, and told each other dumb stories. Nothing scary, nothing serious. Just kids playing at being adults. By midnight, the fire had burned down, and we were lying on our backs, watching the stars. I remember thinking it was the quietest place I'd ever been. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every beat of your heart. The second day, when we found it, we had decided to explore deeper into the woods, maybe find a stream, or a better spot to set up. Jason was the first to see it. A black rectangle lying half buried in the dirt. At first, I thought it was just trash, something left behind by hikers. But when Tyler dug it out with a stick, we realized what it was. A VHS tape. It looked old. The label was faded, worn down until the writing had nearly disappeared. All we could make out were smudges of ink that might have once spelled a name. The plastic casing was cracked on one corner, and a faint smell of mildew clung to it. "Who even uses tapes anymore?" Hannah said, wrinkling her nose. But Tyler, always the curious one, grinned. "We should watch it." We all laughed at first, thinking he was joking. But later that evening, when we returned to camp, he pulled out the old camcorder he'd brought along, something his dad had given him to document the trip. It had a VHS slot. I don't know why, but when he slid the tape in, none of us stopped him. The screen flickered. At first, just static. Then an image appeared, dark, shaky, like it had been filmed with trembling hands. Trees. Our clearing. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Just some random footage of the woods. But then the camera panned, and I saw our tents. Our exact tents. The fire pit we'd made. Even the cooler sitting by the log. The footage was from the night before. I remember the sound, just breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing behind the camera as it moved closer to our tents. It circled them slowly, pausing every so often, as if whoever was filming wanted to savor the view. Once, the camera stopped directly in front of my tent. The screen lingered there for too long. I felt sick watching it, knowing I'd been asleep inside, completely unaware. Jason swore and shut off the camcorder. "This is a joke. Someone's screwing with us." But the tape wasn't funny. And the longer we sat there in silence, the clearer it became. Someone had been watching us. Someone had been close enough to record us without making a sound. That night, none of us slept. We sat around the fire, our eyes darting to the trees at every noise. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful the night before, now felt alive with menace. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, felt like footsteps. At around 2 a.m., Tyler said he heard something. A faint crunch of leaves beyond the tree line. We all froze, listening. Nothing, he insisted though. Said he'd seen movement. We tried to convince ourselves it was an animal. A deer, maybe. But none of us really believed it. By dawn, we were exhausted. Hannah wanted to leave right then, but Jason argued that it was stupid to hike out tired. He said we should sleep during the day and head back in the evening. None of us liked the idea, but we agreed. When night came, we packed up quickly. The forest felt even darker than before, the shadows thicker, as we made our way along the trail. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being followed. I kept glancing back, but the path behind us was always empty. It wasn't until we got back to Jason's house that we decided to watch the tape again. I wish we hadn't. We fast-forwarded through the part we'd already seen. What came next was worse. The footage showed us, that second night, sitting around the fire, looking terrified. From the way we were lit by the flames, I realized whoever was filming had been close just beyond the circle of light. They'd been watching us the whole time, recording our fear. And then the camera turned, slowly, until it faced the woods. In the distance, half hidden by the trees, was a tall figure, not moving, just standing there. Watching the screen went black. We never spoke about it again. Jason buried the tape in his backyard. Tyler swore he'd smashed the camcorder. Hannah refused to come camping ever again. But me, I can't stop thinking about it. Because sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I hear the faint click of a camcorder starting to record. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, there's another tape. One I haven't found yet. One that shows me, right now. But here's the part I never told the others. A few weeks after we buried the tape, I started hearing it again. That sound, the faint mechanical click of a tape recorder, followed by the worry hum of reels turning. Sometimes it was just as I was drifting off to sleep. Other times when I was alone in the house, reading or showering. Always faint, always distant, but always there. I told myself it was in my head. I mean, who even uses VHS anymore? Maybe I'd just let the whole thing get under my skin. But the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got bolder. One night, I woke to find my TV on. The screen was dark gray static, the kind you don't see much anymore since everything went digital. I hadn't touched the remote. I hadn't even plugged the TV. I swear to you I'd unplugged it weeks before, paranoid after what we saw, and yet, there it was. Hissing, buzzing, alive. I stood there in the dark living room, frozen, watching the static swirl and shift. For a second, I thought I saw shapes in it, figures moving through the grain, flickers of light and shadow. And just before I pulled the plug, I swear I heard it again, the whir of a tape. The next day, I dug up the tape Jason had buried. Don't ask me why. Maybe I needed to see it again, to convince myself it was real, that my mind wasn't unraveling. I remember the dirt caked under my fingernails, the smell of damp earth as I pried the box open. The tape was still there, exactly where we'd left it. But the casing was different, cleaner, no cracks, no mildew, like it hadn't aged a day. Like it was brand new. I put it in my bag and told no one. That night, I borrowed an old VCR from my uncle and set it up in my room. My hands shook as I slid the tape inside. The machine clunked word, and the screen flickered to life. At first, it was just the same footage. Our tents, the fire, us sitting in fear. The figure in the woods, nothing new. I almost felt stupid, like maybe I'd imagined the changes. But then the screen cut to black, and kept going. When the image returned, my heart stopped. It was my room, my bed, me, lying asleep under the blankets. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. The camera zoomed closer, slowly, until my face filled the frame. My chest rose and fell with steady breaths. I watched myself sleep for what felt like hours, terrified to even blink, and then, the figure appeared. Standing in the corner of my room, tall, still head tilted, just watching. The screen went black. I tore the tape out, nearly breaking the VCR in the process. I wanted to burn it, smash it, anything to destroy it. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The tape didn't just show the past. It was catching up to the present. Maybe even the future. I don't know if someone's following me, or if something else is recording me, but the sound hasn't stopped. The click of reels, the faint whir in the dark. It's louder now, closer, and sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel it. the weight of a lens on me, watching, waiting. So if you're hearing this, and if you ever find an old tape in the woods, don't watch it, don't even touch it, because once it starts recording you, it never stops, and if you listen carefully enough right now, maybe you'll hear it too. Click whir. Let's move to our third story. When I was in college, I lived in a dorm with one other person. His name was Aaron. At first, I thought he was normal enough. He was quiet, polite, didn't drink much, and kept mostly to himself. Honestly, he seemed like the perfect roommate. You never realize how important that is until you live on campus. The first few weeks went by smoothly. Classes, late-night study sessions, cafeteria foodite was all routine. But then I started noticing something strange. Aaron had this habit at mealtimes. Whenever we sat down at the little table in our dorm, he'd always set out 2 plates, one for himself and one across from him. Even when I wasn't there, I'd come back later and see that second plate sitting there full of food, untouched. Sometimes, he'd even pour water into a second cup. At first, I thought he was just doing it absent-mindedly. Maybe he'd grown up with a sibling and was used to making 2 plates. But after a while, it became obvious that this wasn't random. He was deliberate, careful, almost ritualistic. One night I asked him about it. "Why do you always set a second plate?" He froze. For a second, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, without looking at me, he said quietly, "Because he gets hungry too." A chill ran down my spine. I laughed nervously, trying to play it off. "Who?" But Aaron didn't answer. He just smiled, like I'd asked something silly, and kept eating. After that, I stopped asking. But once you notice something like that, you can't unsee it. I began paying closer attention. At night, after I'd gone to bed, I'd hear him whispering softly. Not to himself, his tone was different, like he was responding to someone. Sometimes I could even hear pauses, as if another voice was answering, though I never caught the words. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I pretended to be asleep, but kept my eyes cracked open. I watched as Aaron set a plate on the table, carefully cutting the food into pieces and arranging it neatly. Then he sat down across from the empty chair and began talking in a low voice. At first I thought maybe he was on the phone. But no, there was no phone in his hand, no glow of a screen. And the way his eyes shifted, he wasn't looking down. He was looking up, directly across from him, at the empty chair. I closed my eyes tightly and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, the plate was empty, not just untouched, empty, as if someone had eaten from it. Things escalated from there. I started avoiding the dorm, spending late nights in the library or crashing in other friends' rooms. But I couldn't stay away forever. One evening, I came back earlier than usual and opened the door without knocking. What I saw made my blood run cold. Aaron was sitting at the table, laughing. His plate was half finished. The second plate was completely clean, as if someone had licked it spotless. But what froze me wasn't the plate. It was the chair. It was pulled back. Not just a little, like someone had brushed against it. It was all the way out, like someone had been sitting there. I must have gasped, because Aaron looked up. His face darkened, almost angry. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said. His voice wasn't his own. It was deeper, rougher. I stumbled back, muttering an apology, and left. I didn't go back that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe Aaron had pulled the chair out himself. Maybe he just ate both plates of food. But deep down, I knew better. The final straw came a week later. It was late, and I'd just finished studying. As I walked back to the dorm, I noticed the lights were on in our room. When I reached the door, I heard laughter. Not just Aaron's, it was overlapping, like 2 voices. One was definitely his. The other was wrong, high-pitched, wet, gurgling, like something trying to mimic a laugh without fully understanding. I froze. I should have turned and walked away, but I didn't. Something compelled me to listen. "Aaron," the voice croaked. "He's watching." There was silence. Then Aaron whispered, "Not yet." I bolted. The next morning, I told the RA I wanted to transfer rooms. I lied, said Aaron was too messy, that I couldn't concentrate. Within a week, I was gone. Months later, I heard the rumors. People said Aaron had disappeared. His roommate, at the time, said he left one night with someone, though he couldn't describe who. Some said he dropped out, others said he moved back home. But I know better, because sometimes, when I eat alone, I feel it. That presence across the table, watching, waiting, hungry, and I've caught myself setting down a second plate. At first I thought it was just a trick of my mind. Maybe I'd spent too many nights worrying about Aaron, letting my imagination run wild. But then it started following me everywhere. Not just in my new dorm room, but in the cafeteria, in the library, even walking alone across campus. I could feel it, a weight in the air, like someone sitting across from me, watching every bite I took, every breath I drew. Sometimes, I could even hear faint whispers when I was alone. Low and slithering, like the sound of someone chewing quietly. It was subtle at first. Plates I set down would sometimes seem lighter than when I remembered picking them up. Forks would slide slightly across the table on their own. At night, I'd wake to the unmistakable sound of someone breathing heavily, not beside me, but somewhere behind me over my shoulder. In the chair I hadn't placed. I tried talking to friends about it, but it sounded insane even to me. No one believed me. Then came the dreams. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, to see the second plate already set at my bedside. Food that I didn't remember cooking, a glass of water I never poured, and always that sense of someone sitting there. Sometimes I would open my eyes fully and see the faintest shimmer, like a reflection, just enough to make me jerk awake. My reflection in the window? No, not quite. Something darker, something separate. I stopped eating alone. Every meal was rushed or skipped, but it didn't matter. Sometimes the plate would be there before I even picked up the fork. Sometimes the food would be gone before I returned to the kitchen. I began to lose track of time. I began to dread every moment I was alone. One night, I snapped. I was sitting at my small table, the second plate there, staring at me like it had always done, mocking me with its emptiness. I slammed my hand down, shoving it across the surface. The plate didn't move. But then, I heard it. The unmistakable clatter of silverware scraping against porcelain, as if someone invisible had just taken a bite. My heart jumped into my throat. I could feel the presence leaning closer, heavier. My room became oppressively hot, the shadows around the corners thickening, pulsing with some unholy life. I screamed. My voice echoed back at me from the walls. And then, silence. I thought maybe it had gone. Maybe it was finally over. But when I dared to look, the second plate was gone. Not just moved, gone. As if it had never existed. And in its place, faint scratches in the tabletop, like someone's fingernails had dug into it. That was when I realized something horrifying. This presence wasn't just watching. It was learning, adapting, growing stronger with each moment. I feared it. I started keeping a journal, documenting every occurrence. Every whispered sound, every plate mysteriously set, every fleeting shadow. But the more I wrote, the more I felt the presence leaning over my shoulder, reading along. Sometimes, I would find sentences I hadn't written, words etched into the page in messy, hurried handwriting that wasn't mine. Set it for him. He's hungry. Feed him. I stopped sleeping entirely. I would sit at my desk all night, staring at the second plate, willing it to stay empty, willing it to leave me alone. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going anywhere, and then it happened. I woke up one morning to find myself in the kitchen, a fork in my hand, chewing mechanically, watching the second plate being filled as I moved the food onto it myself. I wasn't in control. My own hands were serving this entity, and as I ate from my own plate, I felt its presence kneeling behind me, warm and close, whispering in my ear. Good, you understand now, you belong. I tried to resist. I tried to throw the plate across the room, smash the glass, run outside screaming. But my body wouldn't move. The fear was suffocating, thickening in my chest, blending with a strange, nauseating hunger I had never felt before. From that day forward, I wasn't alone. Not ever. It's with me every meal, every night, every quiet moment. And I know now that I will never be free. Sometimes, late at night, I see it reflected in the silverware, sitting there, smiling, patient, waiting. And sometimes, I see my own face, across the table, pale and hollow, eyes blank, setting down the second plate for someone who is not there yet, because it always wants another, and it will never stop. Let's move to our fourth story. It all began in the quiet town of Elmsworth, a place so small that everyone knew everyone else, or at least thought they did. The locals whispered about the old Holloway estate at the edge of town, a crumbling mansion, abandoned for decades, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. No one dared go near it after sunset, but I was never the type to listen to warnings. I was a skeptic, a rational thinker, someone who demanded proof before fear could take hold. That's why, one rainy October evening, I found myself standing at the rusted iron gate, my flashlight cutting a thin beam through the fog. The air was heavy with the scent of damp leaves and rot. The mansion loomed over me like a sentinel from a nightmare, ivy crawling across its facade like grasping fingers. I had come to debunk the local legends, whispers of strange noises, shadows moving against the walls, and the stories of children who had disappeared decades ago, never to be found. It's all superstition, I muttered under my breath, though my stomach churned with unease. The first step onto the overgrown path set the tone. Wet leaves crunched beneath my boots, and somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, as if something or someone was following me. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the musty scent of decay. Wallpaper peeled like shedding skin, and the wooden floors creaked with every step. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the hallway, casting dancing shadows across the walls. And then I heard it, a faint melody, like a music box playing. Somewhere deep inside the house, I froze, telling myself it was the wind. But the tune was deliberate, slow, and undeniably human. I followed the sound, each step heavier than the last, until I reached a grand staircase. The melody came from above, from a room at the end of a long corridor on the second floor. As I climbed, the temperature dropped, and I could see my breath curling in the air. The door at the corridor's end was slightly ajar, the music box still faintly audible inside. I pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted me made me stumble backward. In the center of the room was a small, antique music box, sitting on a pedestal. It played on its own, though there was no visible mechanism turning the keys. Surrounding it were dozens of old photographs, yellowed with age. Children staring blankly from the faded prints, their eyes dark and hollow. And then I noticed one photograph that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me, sitting exactly where I now stood, smiling at the camera, but I had never been there before. The room seemed to breathe around me, the walls pulsing faintly, like the heartbeat of the house itself. My rational mind screamed for explanation, but the creeping dread in my chest told me this was no ordinary place. The music box stopped suddenly, leaving an oppressive silence, broken only by the soft whisper of a voice. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, but the room was empty. Shadows pooled in the corners, unnaturally deep, as if the light itself feared to enter. Then the whisper came again, closer this time, almost behind my ear. "Stay." Panic gripped me, and I ran for the stairs, but the layout of the house had shifted. The corridor I had just walked through stretched impossibly long, doors appearing where none had existed moments before. Hours seemed to pass as I navigated the impossible interior. Every turn led to another room, each more distorted than the last. Mirrors reflected not my own face, but the hollow-eyed children from the photographs. Their mouths moved, forming silent words I couldn't understand, and their hands pressed against the glass, leaving smudges that slowly turned into claw marks. I felt hands brush my shoulder, whispers tickling my ears, and yet, when I spun around, nothing was there. Eventually, I collapsed in a small nursery at the top of the house. A rocking horse moved back and forth on its own, its creaking rhythm echoing through the room. On the floor lay a journal, bound in cracked leather. I opened it and found entries dating back decades, written by someone who claimed to have seen the children. The words were frantic, the ink smeared as if the writer had been crying or bleeding. The final entry chilled me to my core. "They are patient. They wait for the living to join them. They always take one more. I wanted to scream, but the words died in my throat. Something shifted behind me, a movement, slight, deliberate. I dared to glance over my shoulder, and saw them, shadows in the shape of children, pale faces barely visible, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They didn't run, they didn't speak. They just stood there, watching, waiting. In that moment, I understood the truth. The Holloway estate was not haunted in the way stories told. It was alive, feeding on memory, fear, and life itself. Every child, it claimed, was absorbed into its walls, their essence lingering, waiting for the next intruder to wander too close. And now, I was that intruder. Days or perhaps hours passed. Time was meaningless inside that house. My flashlight flickered, constantly, threatening to fail. Food and water were absent, yet I did not hunger. Something else filled me, an unnatural stillness that drained the desire to move, to think. The shadows crept closer with each passing moment, their presence inescapable. And the photographs, more began to appear. New ones, of me, smiling stiffly, standing in the nursery, the corridor, the hallway. The house was rewriting my reality, folding me into its history. I tried to escape again, but every staircase led back to the same room. Every door opened to the same corridor. The music box started again, playing that haunting, repetitive melody. And the whispers, they were no longer warnings, but commands. Join us, stay forever. The shadows reached toward me, pulling at my limbs, at my soul. I felt my mind, fracturing memories blending with those of the unseen children. I screamed until my voice cracked, until my throat burned, until silence swallowed me. And then, stillness. I am not sure how long I remained there, somewhere between awake and dream, self and other. But now I know this. The Holloway estate does not release what it takes. It does not forget, and it does not tire. I can hear it, even now, whispering through the wind outside my window, calling, beckoning. If you ever visit Elmsworth, beware the road to the old Holloway estate. The gate may be rusted, the house decayed, but the house is patient, and it wants more. Let's move to our fifth story. I never believed in curses, at least not in the way people whispered about them in hushed tones around flickering campfires. My skepticism carried me halfway across the country, to a remote Appalachian town, drawn, not by fear, but by curiosity. The locals called it Whispering Hollow, a place steeped in rumors of strange disappearances and objects that carried misfortune. They spoke of a small, unassuming wooden box locked away in the town's antique shop, a box said to bring calamity to anyone who touched it. Naturally, I had to see it for myself. The shop smelled of varnish, old paper, and dust, the kind of smell that makes time feel slow and heavy. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. "Curiosity will cost more than you think," she said quietly, but I laughed it off, chalking it up to the theatrics of someone used to tourists poking around. Then I saw the box. Small, nondescript, made of dark oak, with strange symbols carved along its edges, faintly glowing in the dim light, as though it pulsed with a life of its own. Ignoring my unease, I reached out and lifted it. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, a cold shiver ran up my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The shop seemed to darken, the light dimming subtly, though the sun outside still shone through the dusty windows. Was alone in that moment, yet I could swear I felt dozens of eyes on me, all focused, all judging. I took the box home, placing it on my desk, as if I were handling a fragile artifact. At first, nothing happened. That night, though, I awoke to a low whisper, so faint I thought it was a dream. It grew louder with each passing night, a murmuring that seeped into my thoughts, twisting my dreams into grotesque, vivid nightmares. The box became an obsession. I could not leave it alone, and when I did, I felt its absence like a weight pressing against my chest. Objects in my apartment began moving subtly. Pens rolled across tables, doors clicked shut on their own, and shadows seemed to stretch in impossible angles. I told myself it was stress, the product of too many late nights researching urban legends. But the whispers intensified, now forming words I could almost understand. Warnings, demands, threats. Sleep became a battleground. I awoke screaming, drenched in sweat, and each night the nightmares became more tangible figures reaching out, from dark corners, whispering my name, promising consequences if I ever tried to leave the box behind. I tried giving the box away, returning it to the antique shop, or even throwing it into the river, but it always found its way back to me. Letters slipped under my door with no sender, each one describing events in my life I hadn't told anyone. Friends who came over reported feeling watched, an unseen presence that filled the apartment with oppressive tension. I realized then that the box was not just cursed. It was intelligent, aware, and it fed on attention, on fear, on obsession. Days merged into nights, without distinction. My reflection in the mirror began to shift. At first, just subtle differences, eyes that lingered too long, a smirk that wasn't mine. Then, gradually, the reflection moved independently, mimicking actions before I made them, whispering along with the box. I could no longer trust my own perception. Even the sunlight felt distorted, as if the world had subtly warped around the presence of the box. One night, driven to desperation, I tried to destroy it with fire. The box resisted, glowing brighter, twisting in ways which should not be able to twist. Flames licked it, yet it did not burn, and the whispers turned into agonized screams. The room seemed to collapse inward, walls bending and groaning, a cold wind sucking the air from my lungs. I blacked out, only to awaken with the box resting innocently on my desk, as if nothing had happened. By the time I realized the full extent of its power, it was too late. My life became a series of coincidences and accidents, each more dangerous than the last. People I cared about began avoiding me, then disappearing entirely. I could hear them in the whispers, their voices twisted into laughter and pleas for help. I tried leaving town, but every road looped back to my apartment. The box's influence had tethered me to it. A predator and prey locked in endless orbit. The final straw came one stormy evening. The lights flickered, the room filled with a stifling heat, and the box's carvings glowed brighter than ever. Figures emerged from the shadows, grotesque and distorted, faceless in their rage. I realized then that the box did not merely curse, it claimed, and I was its next offering. I am writing this now in a trembling hand, my life reduced to shadows and whispers. The box sits on the desk beside me, glowing softly, patiently waiting. I know what it wants, and I fear there is nothing I can do to stop it. If you ever come across a small wooden box in some antique shop, remember my story. Curiosity is not harmless. Some things are meant to be left alone, for the cost of touching them may be more than you can ever bear. Even now, as I write these words, I can feel its presence pressing against the edges of my consciousness. It's no longer just the whispers at night, or the shadows that creep along my walls. It's the subtle manipulation of reality itself. Objects rearrange when I'm not looking. Messages appear on my devices that I never typed, and the very air around me seems charged, heavy with malice. I've started hearing faint footsteps following me, even when I'm alone in the apartment. And sometimes, in the reflective surfaces of windows, or my computer screen, I catch a fleeting glimpse of a figure tall, faceless, and impossibly still watching me with intent that chills me to my core. Sleep has become nearly impossible. When I do drift into unconsciousness, the nightmares are no longer mere dreams, they bleed into my waking hours. I see figures darting in my peripheral vision, hear faint, tortured laughter echoing through empty rooms, and sometimes the box itself seems to pulse with a heartbeat I can feel in my chest. I've tried to tell friends, tried to explain what's happening, but who would believe such madness? Those I trusted began avoiding me, their eyes wary and full of unspoken fear. Some even hinted that I was no longer the same person, that something about me had changed, warped by the box's influence. I've come to realize that it thrives on more than fear. It feeds on obsession. The more I try to resist it, the stronger its grip becomes. I've stopped leaving the apartment. Windows and doors are barricaded, yet I know it doesn't need conventional means to reach me. Sometimes I swear I hear the floorboards creak when no one is home, or feel a cold hand brush against my arm. The whispers now speak in complete sentences, commands and taunts that claw at my sanity. Bring it closer. Touch it. Obey. Even my perception of time has become distorted. Hours pass, like minutes, and minutes stretch into unbearable eternity. I sometimes wake in the middle of the night to find days have passed without my noticing or realize. I've been staring at the box for hours without blinking. The outside world has become irrelevant. All that exists is me and the box, an unending cycle of fear, obsession, and helplessness. I've tried to document everything, hoping that recording its actions might give me some leverage, some clue to end this nightmare. But the footage is corrupted. Cameras fail, batteries drain inexplicably, and even digital files seem to vanish when I try to save them. The box resists any attempt to reveal its secrets. It's as if it knows me intimately, reading my thoughts, anticipating my actions, staying always one step ahead. And yet, even in this despair, a small, irrational curiosity persists. I find myself drawn closer to it, compelled by a force I cannot name. I know it's dangerous. I know it will consume me if I allow it, but I cannot look away. Each time I try to resist, the whispers grow louder, more insistent, sometimes speaking in the voices of those I've lost, friends, strangers, people I've only heard of in passing. They beckon me, warn me, or sometimes mock me, but always reminding me of the cost of ignoring it. I fear that soon there will be no difference between reality and the visions it forces upon me. I may cease to exist as I am, becoming merely another shadow in its collection, another voice in its chorus. And yet, I cannot leave it. It is part of me now. I live in the tension between horror and obsession, trapped in a nightmare I cannot escape, haunted by a cursed box whose power I have underestimated at every turn. If you find yourself standing before a seemingly innocent object in some quiet shop, remember my warning. Curiosity can be fatal. Some objects do not just hold history, hold hunger, and once it notices you, there may be no turning back. Let's move to our sixth story. I never thought a simple trip to a local thrift store could change my life forever. But that's exactly how it started. The air in the shop was thick with dust and the scent of old wood, paper, and something faintly metallic, almost copper-like. I wandered the aisles, idly sifting through worn furniture and stacks of yellowed books, when I noticed a peculiar photograph tucked behind a pile of old magazines. The image was black and white, depicting a smiling family in front of a Victorian house. But something about it felt off. The smiles were too wide, the eyes too hollow. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to take it home. Once I hung the photograph in my apartment, strange things began happening almost immediately. At first, it was subtle. I would glance at the photo and feel as though the eyes were following me. Sometimes, when I entered a room, I swore the figures had shifted slightly, as if they were moving when I wasn't looking. I chalked it up to fatigue, but the unease grew with each passing day. Soon I began hearing faint whispers at night, like soft voices calling my name from just beyond the walls. When I turned on lights or looked around, the apartment was empty yet the feeling persisted, heavy and oppressive. It escalated one evening when I woke in the middle of the night. The photograph had fallen off the wall and was lying face down on the floor. My pulse quickened as I bent down to pick it up, and when I turned it over, the image had changed. The family's smiles were gone, replaced by grim expressions, their eyes now staring directly into mine, impossibly black and deep. My apartment felt suddenly colder, and I could hear faint scratching noises coming from the walls, like fingernails against plaster. My rational mind told me it was a trick of the imagination, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Days turned into nights of sleepless terror. Shadows moved where none should, and objects in my apartment began to shift on their own. Books would fall from shelves, lights would flicker without explanation, and the whispers became more coherent, urging me to join them and look closer. I tried ignoring it, tried rationalizing it, but it seemed the photograph had a will of its own, feeding off my fear and obsession. I could no longer focus on work, could not leave my apartment for long periods, and even the few friends who visited noticed something was wrong. They recoiled, murmuring about how pale and distant I had become. and I realized I was slipping into something I couldn't control. One evening, desperate for answers, I researched the photograph online, hoping to find the house or the family depicted in it. I found nothing, no records, no historical archives, nothing. It was as if the image had never existed outside that photograph. That night, the whispers grew louder, almost shouting now, and shadows gathered in corners of my apartment, stretching and writhing unnaturally. The eyes in the photograph seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and I realized, with horror, that the figures were no longer confined to the paper, they were manifesting in my reality. I tried to destroy the photograph. I burned it, shredded it, even submerged it in water, but each time I woke the next morning to find it exactly as before, pristine and unchanged. I was trapped, a prisoner of a cursed object whose power was beyond my comprehension. My sleep became a battleground, with nightmarish visions blending seamlessly into reality. I would awaken to find the family from the photograph standing silently at the foot of my bed, their black eyes fixed on me, unblinking and cold. My sense of time disintegrated, could no longer tell if hours or days were passing. Only the endless presence of their gaze and whispers. I began to notice other, subtler distortions. Mirrors reflected the family even when the photograph was nowhere nearby. Windows sometimes showed their Victorian house, glowing faintly in the distance, as if it existed in a parallel dimension, just beyond the edge of my perception. I tried to leave my apartment entirely, but every route led me back, inexplicably. It was as if the photograph had anchored me, binding me to its malevolent reality. I realized that no one else could help me. They couldn't perceive what I was seeing, couldn't hear the whispers, and trying to explain it only made them fearful of me. Eventually, I stopped fighting. I started speaking to the family, begging them to leave me alone, trying to negotiate with the impossible. They never responded, except for the occasional shift in their expressions, a tilt of a head, a slight narrowing of their eyes which felt like a mockery of my desperation. My life became a constant state of vigilance, every sound and shadow analyzed for signs of their approach. My apartment, once a safe haven, had become a cage. Now, writing this, I can feel their presence behind me as I type. The photograph sits on the desk, unchanged, and yet I know it is watching, waiting. My sanity feels fragile, stretched thin by the relentless, invisible siege. I am trapped in a loop of fear, curiosity, and helplessness, knowing that even these words may reach no one who can save me. I can only hope that by recording my experience, someone, somewhere, will understand the danger of curiosity and the horrors that lurk in seemingly innocent objects. The photograph, like the others before, it is patient. It waits. And now, so do I. The photograph seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and whispers became sharper, almost intelligible, calling my name and urging me closer. I tried leaving the apartment, but every path led me back, as if the image itself had tethered me to that space. Mirrors reflected the family, even when the photograph wasn't near. And I began noticing subtle changes in myself, my eyes darker, my reflection hollow, my voice sometimes echoing words I didn't remember speaking. Sleep offered no respite. I dreamt endlessly of the Victorian house, wandering hallways filled with the same unblinking, grim family staring at me. Days and nights blurred, and reality twisted around the photograph's power. Objects moved, the air grew heavy, and the feeling of being watched never ceased. I became obsessed, unable to leave it alone, yet terrified of what my obsession might unleash. Now, the photograph sits on my desk, unchanging, yet alive. Its eyes follow me, patient, unyielding, as if waiting for the moment I finally become one of them. Let's move to our 7th story. It began with a phone call late at night, one that I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was distorted, a low guttural whisper that seemed to crawl under my skin. "I see you," it said. At first I laughed, nervously, assuming it was a prank. But then came the details: my street, my apartment number, the fact that I was wearing a gray hoodie, exactly as I was in that moment. That was when the laughter died in my throat, replaced by a deep, gnawing unease. Someone or something was inside my life in a way I couldn't understand. I tried to shrug it off the next day, telling myself it had been a weird scam or a random coincidence. But the calls kept coming, always at the same time each night, always describing things only I would know. My friends noticed the shift in Mitha, haunted look in my eyes, the way I flinched at sudden noises, the obsessive checking of locks and windows. I began to feel like a marionette, pulled by invisible strings. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light, felt like a warning. And yet no one else could see the danger I was sensing. The situation escalated when I began finding small, cryptic notes slipped under my door. At first, they were simple. I see you. Then they became more detailed, describing my routine, my errands, even my grocery purchases. Panic gnawed at my chest, but fear wasn't enough to make me act rationally. I began documenting every incident, every call, every note, hoping that writing it down would somehow keep me grounded, that recording the facts would help me escape the creeping madness. It wasn't long before the presence went beyond paper and phone. Objects in my apartment began shifting positions. My keys weren't where I left them. Doors I swore I had locked were slightly ajar. My laptop opened to files I hadn't touched. At first, I thought exhaustion was warping my perception, that sleep deprivation was turning ordinary mistakes into paranoia. But then came the footsteps, light, deliberate steps, that padded across the living room while I was sitting at my desk, typing. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, heart hammering. And the whisper returned, this time so close, I could almost feel the breath. I'm here. Sleep became a terror. Dreams blurred with reality, each night a relentless nightmare, in which I was hunted through empty streets and abandoned buildings. I would wake gasping, certain that a shadow lurked at the foot of my bed, only to find my apartment quiet, the light of morning doing nothing to chase the feeling away. I stopped answering calls, changed my phone number, even considered moving. But no matter where I went, the presence followed. Emails with no sender, messages that appeared and vanished, fleeting glimpses of someone just out of focus in photos. I had taken all confirmed that I wasn't imagining it. One night, as rain battered the windows and the apartment felt impossibly still, the voice spoke again, this time with a demand. Look outside. Trembling, I obeyed. Across the street, under the flickering street lamp, a figure stood perfectly still, facing me. I could not see its face clearly, only that it was unnaturally tall, unnervingly still, and somehow wrong, as if it belonged to a different world. Panic surged through me, yet I could not look away. The figure raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and vanished in a blink, leaving only the storm and the echo of a laugh that seemed to resonate in my skull. From that moment, the presence escalated into a psychological siege. It infiltrated my mind, warping memories, creating false recollections, making me doubt whether I had truly lived certain events or dreamed them. Friends and family began questioning my sanity, my reliability, as I described encounters they could not see. I could feel myself slipping, losing the boundaries between reality and the invasion of this unseen entity. It was no longer a game, no longer a series of pranks, had taken residence inside my life, inside my perception, and I feared it would never leave. Days and nights became indistinguishable. I barricaded myself in my apartment, yet the presence found ways to invade, subtle, uncanny, and deliberate. I began recording audio in every room, hoping to capture something concrete, something undeniable. Often, I would play back the recordings and hear faint whispers, footsteps, the scrape of something moving against wall, sounds that I could not attribute to any known source. I became obsessed, addicted to proof, yet each recording only deepened my dread. The entity seemed to respond to my attempts to document it, as if aware, as if taunting me. The breaking point came when I discovered something I cannot explain. Late one night, I awoke to a sound behind my bed. I turned to find a handpail, elongated, impossibly thin, gripping the edge of the mattress. I froze, paralyzed by fear. The whispers coalesced into words. You cannot hide. And just as quickly as it appeared, the hand withdrew, leaving only the lingering terror and a smear across the sheets that wasn't there before. I understood then that the entity had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just a watcher. It was a predator, and I was its prey in the days that followed. I tried everything rituals I found online, new locks, constantly changing my environment, but nothing worked. The entity's presence adapted, anticipating my actions, infiltrating spaces I thought were safe. Each encounter left me more hollow, more desperate, until I began to question whether I was even still myself, or if the entity had already merged with my consciousness. Panic became my constant companion, sleep a distant memory, reality a fragile, shifting thing I could no longer trust. Now, writing this, I realize that anyone reading may never understand the depth of what I endured. I do not know if it will leave me, or if I will fade entirely, consumed by the relentless psychological invasion. I leave this as a warning. Some presences are not bound by doors, walls, or physical space. They can infiltrate the mind, erase the line between real and imagined, and remain patient for as long as it takes to claim you completely. And I fear that, in the end, I will vanish. My story just another whisper in the night, another warning, unheeded. Even now, the presence lingers in ways I cannot fully describe. Shadows twist unnaturally in corners, fleeting glimpses of movement just beyond my vision. Phones ring with no one on the line, and whispers crawl along the walls, echoing my own fears back at me. I catch reflections that are not mine, faces, in mirrors that vanish the moment I focus. Every attempt to flee feels futile, as though the entity has mapped my mind and my routines, leaving me trapped in a waking nightmare. The terror is no longer just outside, is inside, embedded in my thoughts, turning my own memories into traps. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it laugh, close and familiar, like it has been here all along, waiting for me to realize that escape was never an option. Let's move to our 8th story. It started innocuously enough. I had recently moved into a small, historic apartment building on the outskirts of town. A place that seemed charming at first glance, with its creaking floors and old brick walls. The kind of place with a story that made you smile at its age, rather than fear it. I was excited to finally live alone after years of sharing cramped apartments. But from the very first night, I felt a subtle wrongness in the air. A chill that lingered not just on my skin, but in the corners of my mind, whispering hints that something was off. The first week passed quietly, if not uneventfully. I noticed odd things at odd times. The faint echo of footsteps in the hallways when I was certain I was alone. Doors that seemed to click shut by themselves, and whispers that sounded almost like conversations just outside my bedroom. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the quirks of old buildings, creaking wood, drafty hallways, the acoustics of narrow corridors. But soon, these noises began to take on a rhythm, a deliberate cadence that suggested intention. One night, as rain hammered against the windows, I awoke to a soft scratching at my door. I paused, holding my breath. It was slow, methodical, and unlike anything I had ever heard. The scratching stopped, only to resume on the window beside my bed. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for a flashlight, but when I shone the beam toward the source, nothing was there. I told myself it was an animal or maybe a branch, but the lingering dread gnawed at me. That was the night I first realized this wasn't ordinary. As days turned into weeks, the disturbances escalated. Objects in my apartment began shifting, subtly. Books moved from one shelf to another. Drawers left open that I was certain I had closed. Kitchen utensils rearranged without explanation. My belongings, once predictable, became unpredictable. The sense of being watched grew oppressive. I would catch glimpses of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't align with the light, a figure that vanished the moment I looked directly at it. Panic began to seep into my daily life, though I tried to maintain a veneer of normalcy. I started documenting every odd occurrence, keeping a meticulous journal of times, places, and events. But the more I recorded, the more the presence seemed to respond, almost as if it was aware I was observing it. Notes I didn't write appeared in my handwriting. Cryptic phrases etched on walls or scrawled on scraps of paper. I see you. You're not alone. Don't turn around. My sense of reality became warped. I began questioning my own memory, unsure if I had imagined events or if they truly occurred. The apartment, once a refuge, had become a labyrinth of psychological torment sleep offered no relief. Each night, dreams became indistinguishable from waking life. I would wake in the middle of the night, convinced someone was standing at the foot of my bed, only to find the room empty. Occasionally, I would hear the faintest of breathing, a shallow, deliberate exhale that seemed synchronized with my own heartbeat. I became hyper-aware, paranoid, counting each creak and whisper, unable to distinguish natural sounds from the entity's manipulation. The terror was suffocating, and yet I could not leave. There was an inexplicable draw to the apartment, a magnetic pull that held me hostage in my own home. One afternoon, while reviewing my journal entries, I noticed a pattern I had not seen before. The disturbances seemed to correlate with the times. I was alone, particularly when I was focused or distracted writing, reading, or cooking. The entity seemed to exploit my moments of vulnerability. Determined to confront it, I decided to set traps, motion sensors, cameras, even simple auditory recorders. I wanted evidence, some proof that I was not losing my mind entirely. What I captured shocked me beyond comprehension. The recordings revealed subtle movements I had never noticed. Objects slightly shifting, shadows bending unnaturally, and always, a faint whisper echoing in the background. Sometimes the whispers formed words, taunting or warning me. One night, I reviewed hours of footage and realized with chilling clarity that there was a figure, always just out of focus, standing in the same spot, watching, waiting, observing. The sense of being hunted was no longer metaphorical. It was concrete, undeniable, and terrifying. I reached out to friends, hoping someone could accompany me, validate my experiences, or offer perspective. No one could understand. Each person I invited into the apartment felt a subtle unease, but none witnessed what I had experienced. The entity remained hidden from all except me, invisible yet omnipresent. Isolation became my constant companion, as the walls themselves seemed to close in. I became obsessed with the patterns, obsessively watching the cameras, scrutinizing every shadow, every movement. My life contracted into this one space, defined by fear and anticipation. Then came the first direct encounter. I had been sitting in the living room late at night, reviewing footage, when I felt a sudden drop in temperature. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as if the room itself had become a living organism. I turned, and in the corner, I saw it a shadowy figure, humanoid but distorted. Its limbs elongated unnaturally, its face hidden in darkness. Time slowed, my heart raced, yet I could not move. The entity tilted its head, a gesture almost human in its curiosity, before it vanished without a trace. I was left shaking, realizing that the presence was not confined to passive observation. It could manifest at will, control perception, and invade my physical space. Days became nights in a blur. I stopped leaving the apartment, stopped eating regularly, stopped trying to engage with the outside world. My only reality was the entity, the journal, and the recordings. I began to notice that my own reflection seemed altered. Eyes that weren't mine stared back at me in mirrors, faces that shifted when I blinked. The boundary between self and observer began to collapse. Fear was no longer the only emotion, it was despair, isolation, and creeping madness. One night, I awoke to a sound I will never forget. The sound of furniture moving across the apartment. Slow, deliberate, accompanied by the unmistakable whispering of my own name. Heart hammering, I reached for my phone to illuminate the room. The beam revealed a figure crouched in the shadows, impossibly thin, faceless, and radiating malice. It moved closer, gliding rather than walking, and I felt the weight of its gaze pressing into my chest. I could not scream. I could not run. All I could do was stare, paralyzed by terror and awe. The encounter lasted only moments, though it felt like hours. When I finally dared to breathe, the figure was gone, leaving only a chilling emptiness behind. I understood then that leaving would not save me, that no amount of rational action or escape could sever the entity's hold. It had become part of my life, embedded into my mind, my routines, my very perception of reality. The apartment had ceased to be a home. It was a trap, a conduit, a living nightmare in which I was both prisoner and prey. Now, I write this as a warning. Some presences do not leave. Some follow, unseen, but relentless, shaping your reality, warping your mind, feeding on fear. I do not know if I will ever be free, or if my story will end here, swallowed by shadows. All I can do is document, chronicle the events, and hope that someone, somewhere, understands the danger of the unseen that hides in the mundane, waiting patiently for its next victim. Let's move to our 9 story. It began with a phone call that I couldn't ignore, though every instinct in my body screamed to hang up. The voice on the other end was low and distorted, almost metallic, yet familiar enough to make my skin crawl. "You're next," it whispered before the line went dead. I sat frozen, the dial tone buzzing in my ears like a relentless drum. At first I tried to rationalize it, a prank, a wrong number, someone messing with me. But over the next few days, the calls became more frequent, always the same chilling message. Each one accompanied by something new, a faint scratch in the background, a low groan, or sometimes nothing at all. Just silence, heavy with menace. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. My apartment, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a trap. I noticed small, unnerving details, the light in my hallway flickering when I wasn't near the switch. My shoes shifted slightly from where I left them, and my reflections sometimes seemed delayed or subtly warped. I was being watched, though by what, I could not yet tell. Every moment outside my apartment filled me with a paranoia I could not shake. Streetlights seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, shadows loomed unnaturally, and faces in passing. Crowds lingered a fraction too long, their eyes tracking me like predators waiting for a misstep. The first encounter happened on a rainy evening. I was returning from work, huddled beneath an umbrella, when I noticed a figure standing under the same streetlight that illuminated my front door. I froze. It was tall, thin, and perfectly still, the hood of its jacket casting its face entirely in shadow. For a moment, I thought it was a homeless person seeking shelter, but something about the posture was unnatural, almost predatory. The figure didn't move when I walked past. It simply remained there, staring, as if measuring me. My stomach churned as I hurried home, and when I reached my apartment, the sense of being followed was palpable. Sleep became a battlefield. Every night, I was tormented by dreams that blended with reality. I would awaken to the sound of soft tapping on my windows, or the floorboards creaking outside my door. Once, I woke to find a single, muddy footprint on my living room carpet, though no one had entered. I began setting up cameras, but when I reviewed the footage, the evidence was inconclusive. Shadows moved, objects shifted, but no figure ever appeared clearly, as if whatever haunted me existed just beyond the boundaries of perception. Each day my anxiety deepened, and I became obsessed with patterns, trying to predict when the calls would come, when the figure would appear, where the next warning would be left. The escalation was relentless. One night I returned home to find my door unlocked. I was certain I had locked it, and the lock bore no signs of tampering. Inside, the apartment was silent except for the faintest whisper, almost inaudible, "You can't hide." My pulse raced. I checked every room, finding nothing out of place, yet the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. I realized that the entity or person was not merely observing me. It was invading my space, manipulating my environment to instill fear. Feeding off my anxiety, I began receiving letters the next week. They were handwritten in a spidery, inconsistent script that chilled me to the bone. Each note contained fragments of information about my life that I had not shared with anyone. Places I visited, conversations I had, my daily routines. It became clear that this presence had been watching me long before the first call. The sense of vulnerability was suffocating, and I realized there was no safe place, not even in my own home. I considered leaving the city, starting fresh somewhere else, but something always stopped me. Perhaps it was the creeping feeling that the entity could reach me anywhere. Or perhaps the terror had rooted itself too deeply into my mind to escape. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the letters, I noticed a new one resting atop my computer. I hadn't left it there. The note was chillingly direct. "I am inside your walls." My breath caught in my throat. I touched the paper, half expecting it to burn my fingers with some supernatural heat, but it was cold, ordinary paper. Panic surged. I inspected the apartment obsessively, knocking on walls, checking vents, looking for any sign of intrusion. Every sound became amplified: the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of pipes, the subtle shift of air conditioning. The presence was palpable, as if it existed not in a single location but everywhere simultaneously, like a virus that had infected my home. Days blurred together. I started seeing glimpses of movement in the corners of my eyes, curtains fluttering, though windows were closed, shadows slithering along the floor, fleeting figures in doorways. I stopped answering the phone, disconnected from the world outside, and began keeping meticulous records of every occurrence. Each note, each photograph, each piece of video footage reinforced the horrifying realization. The entity was learning, adapting, anticipating my reactions. I was no longer in control. My life had become a carefully orchestrated nightmare, designed to strip away sanity incrementally. The first physical encounter came unexpectedly. I had been checking my cameras late at night when I felt a pressure on my shoulder, like a heavy hand pressing down. I spun around, heart hammering, but no one was there. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate breathing right behind me, cold against my neck. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The presence lingered for moments that felt like hours before retreating into the shadows. I realized with chilling clarity that it could manifest at will, touch my reality, and vanish without trace, leaving only fear behind. As weeks passed, the psychological strain intensified. I stopped leaving the apartment, stopped eating regular meals, stopped interacting with anyone outside my home. My friends reached out, concerned, but I began to push them away, unable to explain the magnitude of the terror without sounding insane. The entity had isolated me, cutting off external support, feeding on my growing desperation. Every time I tried to rationalize the situation, to convince myself it was human or explainable, the presence would respond with new manifestations: footsteps, whispers, objects moving, shadows bending, impossibly. One night, I awoke to find all the mirrors in my apartment reflecting not my face, but a dark void, a swirling mass of black that seemed to pulse and breathe. I reached toward it, my reflection absent, replaced by what felt like a living darkness. The whispers grew louder, more articulate, forming words. "You cannot escape. You are mine," I screamed, but no sound came from my throat. It was a crushing, suffocating silence, as if my voice had been stolen by the entity. I realized then that this was no ordinary haunting. This presence was intelligent, malevolent, and entirely unconstrained by physical limitations. I began to notice changes in myself. My hands shook constantly, my thoughts fragmented. I experienced gaps in memory, waking to find objects moved, notes written in my hand that I did not remember creating. The entity had begun to manipulate not only my environment but my perception of reality, blurring the line between what was real and what was hallucination. I became a prisoner within my own mind, my sanity dangling by a thread as the presence continued its relentless psychological assault. The final escalation came one stormy night. I was reviewing old footage, trying desperately to find any clue, any pattern, when the screens went black. The apartment was plunged into darkness, save for the intermittent flashes of lightning illuminating the room. I felt it before I saw it: cold, weightless pressure, a shadow moving with intention. I tried to run, but my legs felt like lead, my movements sluggish and unresponsive. The entity loomed over me, its faceless form impossibly tall, its presence a crushing force of malevolent intelligence. It whispered my name, a final lingering promise that my life, my mind, and my reality were no longer my own. I write this now as a record, as evidence, and as a warning. I do not know if the entity is still watching, or if it has moved on to another victim, but I live in constant fear. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light is a potential manifestation of the horror that stalked me. I am trapped within the echo of that presence, haunted not only by what I saw, but by what I cannot see, and what I know is always there, waiting, patient, and merciless. Let's move to our 10 story. It started as an ordinary evening. One of those nights when the city hums quietly, and the world seems paused just long enough for small, unnoticed things to creep into the shadows. I had just returned from a late shift at the hospital, exhausted, craving nothing more than a warm shower and sleep. My apartment felt unusually cold, a chill that seemed to bite deeper than any winter draft. At first, I dismissed it, blaming faulty heating. But there was something else. Something intangible that made the air feel heavy. Like it carried a presence I could not see, but could somehow sense. I had always been rational, the kind of person who needed evidence before believing in anything supernatural. But that night would begin to erode every certainty I had ever held. As I settled into the living room, I noticed a faint tapping sound coming from the hallway. At first, it was slow, irregular, easily dismissible. But as the minutes passed, the tapping became more deliberate, rhythmic, almost as if something was measuring my reactions, testing my fear. I called out, expecting perhaps a neighbor or a stray animal. But no answer came, only silence that pressed in from all sides. My pulse quickened, and a sense of vulnerability I had never known before washed over me. I tried to focus on mundane distractions, checking my phone, scrolling through messages, telling myself I was imagining things. But then the power flickered, not the usual brief blackout, but an odd, stuttering flicker, like the apartment itself was struggling to stay illuminated. Each flash revealed subtle changes. Objects shifted slightly from where I remembered placing them. Shadows in the corners seemed to stretch unnaturally, and reflections in the window did not always match my movements. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, pressing against my chest as though something invisible hovered just beyond sight. Sleep was impossible. I paced the apartment, each step loud in the oppressive silence, my ears straining for the smallest hint of movement. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a low metallic hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I realized, with a creeping dread, that the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My rational mind searched for explanations. Plumbing, neighbors, structural settling. But the pattern was deliberate, intentional. Whoever or whatever was doing this knew my presence, responded to my attempts to ignore it. I felt watched, observed, hunted in a way that defied logic. Over the next few nights, the occurrences escalated. Doors that I was certain I had locked would be ajar in the morning. Small objects on shelves or tables would be rearranged, sometimes forming shapes too precise to be accidental. I began recording the apartment, desperate for proof. But every time I reviewed the footage, the most unsettling moments were missing. Shadows moved in ways that defied the camera's perspective. Figures appeared at the edge of the frame, only to vanish when I tried to focus. It was as if the presence existed on a plane just beyond perception, aware of every method I used to document it. The psychological strain became overwhelming. I began to hear whispers at night, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to echo my own thoughts back at me. Sometimes they repeated phrases I had thought only in my mind. Other times they mocked me, a cruel reflection of my growing paranoia. I stopped leaving the apartment, stopped answering calls, stopped interacting with anyone outside my immediate space. Friends and family called, concerned, but I could not explain the terror without sounding insane. Every attempt to rationalize the events was met with new manifestations, shadows stretching unnaturally, objects moving in impossible ways. The cold presence pressing relentlessly against my consciousness. One night, I awoke to find the bedroom door slightly ajar, though I had locked it before sleep. A low rhythmic breathing echoed from within the darkness, each exhale dragging a chill across my skin. I froze, every muscle locked in terror, unable to move. Slowly, imperceptibly, the door creaked wider, revealing a shadowy figure standing just beyond reach. It was faceless, featureless, yet I felt its awareness, its intelligence, as if it could see into every corner of my mind. The room seemed to constrict around me, walls bending subtly, the floor tilting in ways that defied reality. I tried to scream, to run, but my body refused. Paralyzed by fear, days blurred into nights, each one indistinguishable from the last. The presence became bolder, more invasive. I would wake to find my apartment rearranged, letters left with my handwriting, but messages I did not remember composing. Sometimes the whispers would form coherent sentences, warnings, taunts, intimate knowledge of my past, as if the entity had studied me for months, years, maybe even decades. The psychological assault was relentless, breaking down the boundaries between perception and reality. I could no longer trust my senses. Mirrors reflected, not myself, but shifting shadows. The windows showed streets that did not exist. Voices murmured secrets I had never spoken aloud. The most terrifying event occurred during a stormy night. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark, unnatural bursts. I saw the figure fully for the first time, not a human, but a distortion of shadow, a shape that bent and twisted in ways impossible in our world. It moved with purpose, gliding rather than walking. Eyes or their absence fixed on me with intent that chilled my very soul. The whispers became articulate, filling the room with words that clawed at my mind. You are mine. There is no escape. The air itself seemed to resist my movement, heavy, viscous, as if I were trapped in an invisible current pulling me toward the entity. I attempted to flee, to abandon the apartment, but the presence followed. No matter where I went, I felt its weight pressing on my back, a constant reminder that my fear was now tethered to reality. Every place became unsafe, every shadow a potential threat. Sleep offered no respite. The entity infiltrated dreams, twisting them into nightmares that lingered long after I awoke. My body weakened under the stress, my mind fraying at the edges as the relentless psychological assault continued without mercy. In desperation, I sought help from expert psychologists, paranormal investigators, anyone who might offer insight. But each intervention failed. Devices malfunctioned in the apartment, recordings corrupted, and the presence seemed to mock every attempt to understand it. Friends who visited reported feelings of unease, nausea, and an inexplicable fear that made them flee quickly. The entity's influence was not confined to my mind. It extended beyond, shaping reality to maintain control, feeding on the fear it instilled. Eventually, I realized the terrifying truth. The presence had no interest in physical harm. Its goal was far more insidious: to consume my perception of reality, to strip away every certainty, leaving only the raw, unfiltered terror of existence. Each whispered word, each shadow, each subtle movement of objects served a purpose: to erode my understanding of what was real. The world outside became irrelevant. The apartment, once a sanctuary, was now a labyrinth of fear, and I, its prisoner. I write this as a record, perhaps a warning. I do not know if the entity will ever release me, or if it has moved on to someone else. But the sense of being watched, manipulated, and hunted is constant. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light is a potential manifestation of that malevolent intelligence. My life is no longer my own, and I exist in a perpetual state of dread, a living testament to the presence that haunts not only space, but the very fabric of perception. I am trapped in its awareness, and I fear that nothing, not distance, not reason, not even death can truly separate me from its influence. Let's move to our 11th story. It began on an unremarkable Sunday morning, the kind where the sun peeks through the curtains lazily, and the world outside hums with distant life. For James, a 29-year-old graphic designer living alone in a cramped city apartment, the day held no promise of anything unusual. He had planned a simple routine: coffee, a few hours of freelance work, and then errands in the afternoon. But the ordinary rhythm of his life would soon fracture in ways he could never anticipate, leaving him questioning not only his perception of reality, but his very sanity. The first sign was subtle: a fleeting shadow across the living room wall, so quick that he almost dismissed it as a trick of sunlight passing through the blinds. But when he turned his head, the space was empty, undisturbed, as though the shadow had never existed. James chalked it up to fatigue, or perhaps overcaffeination. Yet over the next few hours, the phenomena grew in frequency and intensity. Shadows no longer followed predictable patterns, and reflections in his monitors and windows sometimes revealed figures standing behind him, figures that vanished the instant he turned around. At first, he told himself it was stress, a simple case of urban paranoia, amplified by isolation. But then came the voices. Not loud, not commanding, but soft, insidious. Murmurs that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. They were almost inaudible at first, just on the edge of hearing, making him question whether he had imagined them. Yet they became more distinct with each passing day, fragmented phrases, snatches of words, sometimes calling his name. He began recording the apartment audio, hoping to capture proof. But playback always revealed only static, the whispers mysteriously absent. One night, exhausted from work, and the creeping unease that had become his constant companion, James awoke to a cold draft that seemed to crawl over his skin. The apartment felt larger, emptier than it should, as if the walls had receded into an endless void. He could hear the faint creak of floorboards above him, though he lived alone on the top floor. And then he saw it, a thin, distorted figure, perched at the end of his bed, its features obscured by darkness. Limbs unnaturally elongated, eyes, or what he assumed were eyes, glinting faintly like distant stars. He froze, every instinct screaming to flee, yet his body betrayed him. Rooted to the mattress by a terror he had never known. Days merged into nights, in a haze of dread. James attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy, answering emails, cooking meals, and occasionally stepping outside for fresh air, but the apartment remained a prison. Objects subtly shifted while he worked, books slightly askew. Utensils moved from their places, and once his laptop appeared open on a table he had left empty for hours. Nothing ever fell or broke. Everything remained intact, yet unmistakably rearranged. The presence did not seek to destroy. It seemed to exist solely to remind him that he was never truly alone. He began documenting his experiences meticulously, writing notes, taking photos, and attempting video recordings. But each time, the evidence betrayed him. Cameras captured only empty spaces, audio picked up only static, and the figures, when glimpsed, appeared only in fleeting, almost imperceptible distortions. James realized he was witnessing something that existed in a layer of reality beyond conventional perception, force aware of him, testing boundaries, asserting dominance without physical contact. The psychological strain became overwhelming. Sleep was elusive, plagued by nightmares in which he was hunted through corridors that mirrored his apartment but twisted into impossible angles. Whispers followed him into dreams, repeating thoughts he had never voiced aloud. Friends and family noticed a change. James was withdrawn, pale, jittery, and constantly glancing over his shoulder. They dismissed it as stress or burnout, leaving him to confront the entity alone. One evening, the figure became more assertive. As James prepared dinner, he noticed the shadows in the kitchen stretching unnaturally, bending toward him. A faint tapping emerged from the cabinets, slow and deliberate. And he realized the sound was not random, but rhythmic, almost communicative. When he reached for a knife, the utensil slipped from his grasp, hovering momentarily in midair, before clattering to the floor. Fear transformed into a gnawing certainty. This presence could manipulate matter, bending the physical world around him to its will. Desperate for relief, James attempted to leave the apartment. Each step toward the door was met with resistance, inexplicable obstacles that delayed him, locks failing to turn, furniture subtly blocking passages, lights flickering violently. Even when he managed to step outside, he felt the presence following its weight, a suffocating presence in the periphery of his vision. Every public space felt unsafe, every shadow a potential threat. The entity had no interest in him leaving it, needed him trapped, ensnared in fear, alone and isolated. Days turned into weeks, and the manifestations escalated. James began hearing clear sentences, whispered in perfect mimicry of his own thoughts, revealing secrets he had never shared, fears he had never spoken aloud. He could feel its gaze even in darkness, a constant awareness pressing into his consciousness. Mirrors reflected distorted versions of himself, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that stared back with malevolence. Even in daylight, the apartment seemed permeated with unnatural darkness, corners bending, walls breathing subtly, as if reality itself had become fluid and unreliable. Attempts to seek help proved futile. Paranormal investigators visited, recording equipment malfunctioned, and spiritual practitioners fled, unnerved and defeated. Psychologists suggested hallucinations, sleep deprivation, or psychosis. But James knew the truth. The presence was real, a conscious, intelligent force that existed just beyond the layer of perception, accessible to others. It was patient, relentless, and invisible to all but him. The isolation became unbearable. No one could see or help, and no technology could capture evidence of the haunting. One night, James awoke to find the figure, not at the foot of the bed, but beside him. It leaned closer, a faceless presence radiating cold intent. The whispers intensified, speaking not only in words but in emotions, pure dread, hopelessness, and despair. The apartment seemed to warp around him, furniture elongating, walls bending, and shadows stretching into impossible dimensions. The presence communicated not with force, but with fear, a psychological grip so profound, it left him paralyzed in body and mind. In the following days, James's world contracted entirely around the apartment. Sleep, food, and even time became irrelevant. Existence itself was dominated by the entity's subtle manipulations. He would see fleeting movements from the corner of his eye, feel breath against his neck with no one behind him, and wake two objects arranged in symbols that defied explanation. Every moment became a test of endurance, a negotiation of fear, and an exercise in understanding the limits of human perception. Eventually, James understood that the presence's goal was not physical harm. It sought the complete erosion of his certainty, the collapse of perception, and the total domination of consciousness. Each rearranged object, each whisper, each shadow, each impossible reflection served a singular purpose: to remind him that reality was fragile, and that he was merely a subject in a game played by something incomprehensible. The terror was existential, stripping away every layer of normalcy, leaving raw vulnerability exposed to an intelligence that existed beyond human understanding. He began writing a journal, hoping to preserve his account in words, if nothing else. The presence remained, always observing, always adapting, and always patient. He learned that sleep was no longer a refuge. Dreams became extensions of the haunting, with the figure following him, whispering, reshaping nightmares to match his deepest fears. Attempts at distraction, work, or human interaction only provided brief reprieves before the omnipresent dread returned. James realized that escape was impossible. Every moment outside the apartment felt like a tethered illusion. The entity's influence stretched beyond the confines of his physical home. He could not run, could not hide, and could not reason away the terror. The haunting was complete, and he had become an instrument of his own fear, existing in a perpetual state of psychological siege. His story, if recorded, would serve not only as a warning, but also as testimony to the fragility of perception when confronted by a conscious and intelligent force beyond comprehension. He writes this now, documenting the events, in hopes that anyone might understand. The presence has no interest in destroying life. It is beyond morality, beyond comprehension, existing solely to assert dominance over perception and sanity. James's existence is a testament to its power, a chronicle of relentless psychological horror, and a reminder that some forces cannot be measured, fought, or escaped. Awareness alone has become a trap, and reality itself is no longer a sanctuary. He remains under observation, a life consumed by unseen eyes, a mind dominated by whispers, shadows, and the quiet, unyielding assertion of an intelligence that cannot be defeated. Let's move to our 12th story. The story begins with the faint hum of the city outside, a sound that felt distant and hollow to me that night. I had just moved into a small, decrepit apartment on the outskirts of town, a place I found online, at a price so low it seemed absurd. The landlord was vague, smiling in a way that made my stomach twist, brushing off questions about the building's history. I told myself it didn't matter. Cheap rent meant I could finally have a space of my own. The first few days passed uneventfully, though the building had an odd stillness, as if time itself moved slower inside its walls. My neighbors were scarce, and the ones I did see kept to themselves, eyes always darting nervously toward the shadows. It started small. At first it was the sounds, the faint scratching behind the walls at night, like fingernails scraping wood. I chalked it up to rodents, the old pipes, my imagination, anything but what my gut screamed. Then objects began to move, a pen rolling off my desk, the books on my shelves slightly shifted. I told myself I must have misplaced them, but as the nights went on, the disturbances grew bolder. I would wake to find chairs overturned, the door to my bedroom slightly ajar, even though I was certain I had locked it. Each morning I felt more exhausted, drained in a way that sleep should not allow. One night, I awoke to a cold breeze on my neck, the window wide open, though I remembered shutting it. That's when I first saw it, just a shadow, fleeting, at the edge of my vision. It moved too fast to be human, yet too deliberate to be random. I froze, heart hammering, convinced I imagined it. But then came the whispering. I couldn't make out words at first, just low, guttural murmurs that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. The air grew thick, suffocating, pressing down on me until it felt impossible to breathe. My body wanted to flee, but my mind was paralyzed, trapped between disbelief and terror. Days passed. I stopped leaving the apartment except for necessities, my fear of what waited outside or inside growing unbearable. I tried to record the strange occurrences with my phone, but the footage always came out blank, the sounds missing, as though whatever haunted me existed outside the lens of reality. I started documenting everything in a notebook, desperate to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Each entry was punctuated by anxiety, my handwriting shaking as if the fear itself had taken physical form. It was on the 7th night that I realized I was not alone. I awoke to the feeling of being watched, the air cold and heavy. My eyes caught movement from the corner of the room. A figure, impossibly thin, eyes glowing faintly like coals in a dying fire. It didn't approach, but it didn't need to them. Mere presence pressed against my mind, filling me with a dread so complete it left me hollow. I tried speaking, whispering, but no words came out. My throat was paralyzed. I could only watch, as it lingered, waiting, patient and silent. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving the room colder, emptier, yet heavier with its absence. Sleep became impossible. I sat in the darkness, listening, trying to rationalize every noise, every flicker of shadow. It wasn't long before I began noticing the patterns. The whispering intensified when I entered certain corners. The shadows stretched unnaturally when I moved. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, feeding on my fear, growing stronger. With each heartbeat, one evening, desperate for answers, I knocked on the landlord's door. He answered with a smile too wide, eyes gleaming unnaturally. "Ah, you've met it," he said calmly, as though discussing the weather. "Most leave, few stay. You're special." I stumbled back, confusion and horror warring inside me. He said nothing more, just closed the door, leaving me with a heavier sense of doom. By the next night, the presence became more aggressive. I would feel invisible fingers brushing my skin, hear guttural laughter echoing through the apartments, empty halls. I tried to leave, but every exit seemed blocked. Doors would slam shut before I could reach them. Stairwells would twist impossibly, leading back to the same corridor. It was no longer just a haunting, it was a trap. The building itself had a will, and it had chosen me. My sense of reality began to unravel. I couldn't trust my own senses. The shadows became more solid, shapes twisting into faces that leered at me, before dissolving back into darkness. Eventually, I discovered the journal left by the previous tenant, left hidden under a floorboard. Its pages were filled with frantic entries, much like my own, describing the same figure, the same oppressive fear. One sentence repeated endlessly: "It wants your mind. It thrives on your terror. It never leaves." The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was not merely being haunted. I was prey, and the apartment was the predator. Every action I took only fed it, strengthened it. The whispers grew louder, forming words I could barely comprehend. Stay, forever. I lost track of time. Days and nights blurred together. The figure no longer needed to appear, it existed everywhere, in every reflection, in every shadow, in every sound. I started to forget what it was like to be alone, to feel safe. Even when the city lights pierced my windows, the presence remained, unyielding. I tried calling for help, but no one heard me. My phone would glitch, my messages unsent, and strangers passed me by without a glance, as if I had become invisible. The final entry in my notebook is the most coherent, a warning to anyone who might read it. Do not move into 12B. Do not look into the shadows. It knows your fear. It will never let you go. I write this not because I hope to survive, but because I hope someone else does. The apartment, the figure, the building, they are patient, eternal. And I am still here, still listening, still trapped. Even as I write these words, I feel it pressing closer, the air thickening, the whispers growing insistent. I do not know how long I have left before it fully claims me. I cannot leave. I cannot escape. If you find this story, heed the warning. Some doors once opened can never be closed. Some shadows once noticed can never be unseen, and some buildings never forget.